has everybody signed this? Those who are taking the course for credit? Before we get started, I just wanted to just do a quick, we thought that we should talk about maybe one quick item of interest that happened this past week that relates to water infrastructure. And this week, there's been a lot of news about coming from England on flooding and the Thames River, flooding, and we thought we'd just show something quick. Do you know what this is or what it does?
Into a garage.
Pardon me?
It's like a floodgate.
It is like a floodgate, and maybe we'll see a
Is it
short.
energy generator?
It would be cool if it does that, but maybe we'll just take a look at a quick video that maybe explains some of this. Maybe over the water moving over the lines.
So those are the floodgates to the left, Tree? Is that right?
Yeah, it's over there.
Okay.
I'll skip over it a little bit.
So how much did they cost?
I have no idea.
Yeah, those floodgates.
It has to be pretty expensive. Did you also notice a grassy patch sort of close to the banks? Again, meant for this natural spread of the water whenever this happens, so that you're not actually flooding in terms of damage. So you're not like damaging property and infrastructure, but you're allowing the river to expand and then contract. But of course, this is all controlled and obviously meant to protect a lot of property and the city itself. And right now it's flooding again heavily. England and that whole region is getting hammered with rains. So we just thought we'll include that before our speaker presents. So on to you, Todd. Dr. Todd Walter. He's a professor now? Associate professor in the Biological and Environmental Engineering department. He works on a bunch of topics: hydrology, climate change, what else? Whatever. All of those things. Okay, whatever. I didn't say all of those things. And he's going to talk about some of those topics.
Okay. So can I have the music on?
Sort of in the background?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think would help a lot. I have a.
I can minimize this for you and open it.
Okay, yeah. Why don't you do that? Because I didn't want you. And does this thing run it?
The projector. This is the projectors.
So if I want to click forward,
Yeah.
do you have a long pole?
I need it both.
The mouse is wireless, right?
Oh, look at that. I can try that.
As soon as this thing opens, yeah, we should be able to.
Let's see. Let's try that. Okay. And I can. If we can do the maximize.
Sure. You can do it from here.
Well, you
I
have to do
can.
with the
Oh,
mouse
really? I
too.
can. There I am.
It's over here.
Oh, look at that. Okay. All right.
Okay.
So Brian sent me my topic, thank goodness. So now I know. So I know what I was going to talk about. It's going to be hydrology, natural systems, and green infrastructure, which seems like a lot of things put together, sort of a little bit randomly. And so we'll just jump right in on this. Let's see how this is going to work. I'm a little bit nervous about this. Oh, look at that. So I'm going to do the thing a little bit backwards. I want to just acknowledge the people who worked on some of the work, the actual research that I'll show at the end of this. Lauren is right here, and she's sort of been kind of the person in charge. But then these other 5 women are all undergraduates. Oh, look at that. I got all sorts of tools. Now I have too many tools. And then these other 5 women are all undergraduate students, either in my department or in the SNES program. And I should have mentioned many of these women went and got research proposals funded to actually carry out this work. But this is always the thing that you forget at the end of the presentation. And I thought I wanted to just get that over with here at the beginning. And Water Resource Institute has been gracious in funding this. So I think hydrology. If we start with hydrology, I think a good context to start is to talk about a watershed. Does everybody know what a watershed is? Explain to me what a watershed is.
So basically, any rain that falls in a watershed is going to go to like a central source in the watershed. So anything happens in the watershed affects everything else.
Everything else, yeah. So it's either going to go down to the river, or it's going to go out it's going to go out as evaporation. So this is a picture from Haiti. If I walk over there, I could be violating the rule of videography.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so if we here you can see 2 streams here, and if you can choose any point in a landscape to begin a watershed. Usually the ridgetop is not the best choice, but if we look at this river here and we say, okay, I want to know the watershed that defines this point here. You can imagine going up along this ridge here, and everything that falls on this side is going to fall away from the river I'm interested in, and everything that falls on that side is going to fall into the river. And you can imagine tracing a line that would define the inside and outside of that watershed, okay? And that helps us get a closed system. So no water ever moves back and forth across that boundary. So everything's inside of it. And when we look at things on a watershed scale, it makes math really simple, which is something that I take advantage of. And so if we look at, oops. Now I have a lot of tools here. Let's try this one.
That one won't do it.
This one won't do it.
It'll just do the pointer.
Oh, this is my laser pointer.
Yeah.
Oh, look at
Can't find it.
Okay, so let's get, if I can get to the next slide. I see 2 slides over there. Okay. Oh, maybe do I do this? No? Okay, so this is tricky. So maybe I'll just,
We need the keyboard, if you bring the keyboard over and use the
arrow.
arrow.
Well, I'll just write the equation because I memorized it. So basically, the only way water gets into a watershed is through precipitation. Okay, sometimes there's cloud force and stuff, but for all practical purposes, it's precipitation. Oh, look! Oh! 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 Oh!
You were clicking it the wrong way.
I was clicking it the wrong way. There's just one button. How can I click it the wrong way? Okay. Obviously, I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, so the only way water gets into a watershed is through precipitation, and it either flows out through the stream, that's what Q is, or it goes out top through evapotranspiration. And whenever you're gaining more water, draining more than water's flowing out or evaporating, your watershed's getting wetter. So that DSDT means it's a change of water inside the watershed. And if you're flowing out and evaporating faster than raining, then your watershed's getting drier. Okay, and so this becomes a very simple equation. It helps us to helps us to design experiments. Okay, and so one of the things we're going to get to the green infrastructure eventually, but we have green infrastructure because we've screwed around with the watershed and changed this equation. Okay, and so one of the let's see if I can remember which button here it is. So one of the famous screw around with the watershed experiments was the Hubbard Brook experiment. Okay, and so this is another watershed here, and this watershed used to look like all the other watersheds in that it had trees in it until they cut them all down. Okay, and then they were afraid they were going to grow back, so they also used herbicides for a few years to make sure nothing happened. And you think, and then they had watersheds on either side of this, and they were monitoring the water flow coming out of all those watersheds. So we have more water flowing out of the watershed where you cut the trees down, or more water flowing out of the watersheds where you still have trees. You're being graded on this question. It's the only question on the exam. Yes?
The denuded landscape is going to give you more water
Because of why?
because it's not infiltrating into the ground.
That is incorrect, but that you got the right answer for the wrong reason. It actually was, they actually left the glitter on the surface so that the soil wouldn't seal up. So, and then one of the things this was criticized, so they were trying to see what the effects of logging were. That was one of the criticisms of this experiment, is that they left all the debris on the surface and just kept spraying it down. So the raindrops didn't break up the soil and seal it. What actually happened here is you weren't transpiring water anymore because the trees were transpiring. So everything that would have transpired, or everything that did transpire in these adjacent watersheds, now just went to the stream and flowed out eventually. Okay, and so this was kind of a famous experiment. And then they let it grow back to see how long it would take it to get back to the original state. Okay, so we have something analogous happen when we develop landscapes. Okay, so if we look at a developed landscape, here's our Hubbard Brook, okay, analogy. But we've cut trees down, but more importantly, we've covered parts of the landscape up with these impervious surfaces. And one thing that impervious surfaces do much more poorly than trees do is transpire water. Okay, so from just the perspective that you've covered up areas that would have transpired, you will have more water out of a developed landscape than you will out of a natural or forested or grassland landscape. Okay, and we can think about this a couple of ways. So let me draw a storm hydrograph here. Okay, so if I put on this axis my flow, what I call Q in that equation, and on this axis I put time. Okay, and if we have a stream flowing, okay, it's gradually going down, down, down. But then if we have a storm right here, make it harder on me by turning the light off. Okay, so if we have a storm, what happens even in a forested watershed is that the water, the hydrograph, the flow going out of the watershed will go up, and then when the storm stops, it'll eventually come back down again and kind of start to curve off like that. Okay. Now, some of this water, how that water is getting to the stream is still not easy to know. Okay. But we know that some of it's got there very quickly because this hydrograph went up, and some of it got there randomly. So conceptually, you can kind of think about dividing this hydrograph into kind of two regions. This would have been sort of the groundwater. Okay, that's kind of slowly leaking back to the stream, and then this would be we'll call this the storm runoff. And exactly how it got there is not entirely clear, as I said, but we can kind of think about it as those two things. Okay. One thing that happens is as you develop the landscape, as you not only stop transpiration, but you stop the water from getting into the ground easily. Okay. In some cases, you can imagine like if you had one house, say in the state of Idaho, chances are that water would probably still get back into the ground. It would flow to the side of the house and go down into the groundwater. But eventually, you get so much of the landscape covered up that you can't get that water back into the ground. And so what ends up happening is you end up increasing the storm runoff part and decreasing the groundwater part as you develop more and more landscape. Okay? And one of the things, and you can imagine like taking this to sort of an extreme situation where you have parking lots and buildings, there's virtually no area in which you could infiltrate water back into the groundwater. Okay? Now one of the things that Dr. Snyder and I worked on was road ditches. And one of the things I hadn't thought of until we worked on this, we were working on agricultural landscapes, okay? And these are still highly impervious. There's not a lot of infrastructure there. But what there was road ditches. And so one of the things that makes this peak go up, more so even than the impervious areas, is the fact that when we put an impervious area in place, we don't want it to get flooded. So either we build a giant thing like they had there in England, which we didn't do, or you do things to kind of move that water away from your infrastructure so it doesn't flood it. That, I think, as much as anything else, causes this peak in storm flow to go up and up and up. Okay, so all the water comes off of our roofs. If you just put it in your yard, it probably re-infiltrates again, but if you stick it in a pipe and take it to a ditch and the ditch runs immediately to a stream, then you start to really pump up the amount of water going into the storm runoff. Okay? So, was this your slide? These are yours, aren't they? Okay, so these are some slides I stole. And so here, I was mining desperately last night for this presentation.
That's Jonathan Antonelli's photograph.
What's that?
That's Jonathan Antonelli Russell's photograph.
Okay, thank you for the credits there. Okay, that's a worm. Okay, and so here's a way of kind of thinking about the way the flows are changed. So here's sort of a pre-development landscape. And the blue arrow is the stuff that's coming that generally gets into the ground and flows slowly back to the stream, and it's big because it's a lot of water, okay, not because it's moving faster. And then this red one is kind of the storm runoff, okay. And then when we develop the landscape, okay, like this, you sort of trade those places. You end up with a lot more storm runoff. Again, as much because of the infrastructure you put that water into to get it back to the stream as because you have impervious surfaces. Okay, and so because of this, so this causes downstream problems, right? And so if I am the city of Des Moines, Iowa, okay, and I put my city up, and now I want to make sure it doesn't get flooded, so I put all the water in pipes, and I stick it out in the Mississippi River, that's great. My city's fine. But unfortunately, St. Louis downstream was counting on the water that used to go into the ground at Des Moines, staying in the ground for a little longer, and it didn't. It went right into the river. So now St. Louis has a problem. So they have to do something and so they have to build one of these expensive things like they have in England or something different. And so this was a big issue, and people recognized that you couldn't have upstream people putting lots of water in the stream quickly because they had downstream ramifications. So 1970s, 1980s, we started to really kind of, so actually, first of all, so let me just see what my next slide is. Okay, so the original way we tried to deal with these things, with these problems, was to put up massive, just like we just saw, but without the music, massive structures to control the floods, okay? And so this is the Mount Morris Dam that protects Rochester or Syracuse? Rochester. Okay, yeah. So it looks like there's a lake back here, but it only looks that way because we're in the middle of a big storm, okay? Usually there's no water at all behind there. So when you go there, it's like you're on the Great Wall of China, and you look down, you see this tiny little stream going underneath the dam, right? But what they did is in the bottom of this dam, there's a hole that only lets so much water pass through. And if you're putting more water behind the dam than can go through that hole, it builds up into a big lake, and it gets released slowly back into the stream. Okay, and that's the way of dealing with these big amounts of water that come out of developed areas. That's the way you control it so it doesn't have a downstream impact. Okay, and you can't see this, and I'm sorry, I should have got a lighter slide. This is a similar structure that's above the town of Dryden. Am I still in the thing? I'm okay? Okay, you're gonna tell me if I'm not, right? Okay. So this is the top of a really big earthen dam. okay? And this is Virgil Creek above Dryden, and this does the same thing. Underneath the dam there's a little tiny hole that the stream can go through during regular flows, but when you get a big storm, it can't all get through that hole, so it builds up behind this dam and then gets released slowly, so Dryden doesn't get flooded anymore, okay? So that's kind of the way things were done, and this was actually built in the 1990s, and I think it's among the last in New York State that'll get built this way, because it was sort of a rethinking of how we should be dealing with these flooding issues, okay? And the thought was maybe we should, if somebody puts in a parking lot or builds a house, maybe they should deal with their own damn flood water, and we shouldn't have it go down the river at all. So we started making detention basins, okay? And so this is a similar concept, but now you have like there's a parking lot next to this little area here, and what you have is you have depression, okay, that the water can flow into, and you got the same thing. You basically have a dam, and there's a little hole in it someplace so that the water can't, it can only let so much water through there. So if you get a big flood that comes off that parking lot, it goes in here, it fills up, and that gets released slowly back into the stream. Okay, but you're doing this in a distributed way at every little parking lot and shopping mall, as opposed to in the end of a big river.
When did you say the era of the detention basin started?
So 1970s, I think, is when you're seeing the first ones go in, okay? But it was different because this is one of those things that tends to be controlled on a state-by-state level, okay? But there were some going in other parts of the country as early as the 70s, and I only know that because I found a paper where they were evaluating contaminant buildup, and they had one that was long enough that it could have been in the 70s, okay? But these really became popular in the 90s, okay? And so now virtually you go to any Applebee's, they're going to have one of these things right for their parking lot. So that was the thing, and so that was good, and it seemed to have an impact. There was some question as to whether these would work, but they appeared to kind of do the job. So we kind of are dealing with the flood flow situation, okay? And here's a similar concept for agricultural lands, okay? So what they did here, this is a field, and it was producing too much runoff, and they were really more concerned with erosion than flooding. But you can see they built this little berm, and then this standpipe here. That pipe goes down into a subsurface drain, and they got a little orifice in it that only lets the water go through there so quickly. So that way they're keeping that water from moving too quickly off the landscape. So if you ever see these little orange pipes sticking up in fields, that's what they're doing there. Okay, so that's purely mechanical. We're slowing the water down. But then the issue came up as you move through the 80s and into the 90s is, you know what? You've reduced the peak flows. Okay, so instead of having this runoff go higher and higher, you store it for a while. So when you put one of these detention basins in, what happens instead of the peak flow getting up really high is you kind of store it for a while, and then you release it very slowly back out into the stream. So you bring the peak flow down by storing it for a while. Okay. The problem is that water just came off of a parking lot that's had cars and buses on it, and so there's also the oils and greases and metals that get washed off with the water and go in. So even though the peak came down, it's still carrying a bunch of crap with it that we don't necessarily want to get into the streams, especially small sediments. A lot of stuff gets bound to the small sediments. And so we started thinking, well, but is there some way we can deal with the water quality issue? Okay, and I'm going to jump into green infrastructure because that's kind of one of the things that the green infrastructure is trying to deal with, although people had tried similar things before that term became a buzzword. And so green infrastructure is kind of an amorphous term, and so I grabbed these two definitions, one from the EPA and then a similar one actually from some people up at SUNY ESF. And essentially, the idea is to try and, you've disturbed the landscape with your development. Can you somehow reinstate the processes that were happening before you did that, okay, and try and make the landscape at least behave naturally, even if you have to do it in a somewhat unnatural way, okay? And so you want to somehow, so it's not a natural thing, for example, to stick all the water in a detention basin and have it go out through a small hole. There's not very many things in nature that do that, okay? So that's so we're trying to say, can we do something more natural? And so, for example, one of these things is porous pavement, okay? Instead of having an impervious surface that covers up the ground and the water can't infiltrate, can we put something down that has the same, serves the same function that we need from pavement, but it allows the water to move through it, okay? And so there's lots of different kinds. This type here has been around for a long time. It's basically cinder blocks with holes in it so the water can get through there. And now they got kind of fancier stuff here, where this is a way they pour the pavement that allows water to pass through. Okay, and this is not, unfortunately, these are not very cheap usually. And one of the big issues is you still need something underneath there that can take the water, but will be strong enough to support the cars and stuff on the pavement. Okay, and some people here at Cornell developed what they call a structural soil that does that. Oftentimes under the porous pavement, they'll try and make some sort of area with big voids so you can kind of capture that water and let it infiltrate more slowly, because you obviously can't have it sitting on the pavement for a while. I was skeptical as to whether this type of stuff would work here in the Northeast. I thought it would clog and freeze in the winter and break up, and it appears to be working pretty well against what my intuition told me. Okay, so there you go. You're taking and getting rid of the pervious landscape and replacing it or getting rid of the impervious landscape and putting a pervious landscape back in place. So that's one of these things that's falling under the, even though there's nothing green about concrete, you return that natural functioning to the landscape. Okay. Another one that gets a lot of attention is green roofs. Okay, and so these ones are green. Okay, unlike the pavement, but or at least for part of the year. But the idea is that we have all these house or building tops. Could we actually just the landscape used to be down at the ground where the bottom of the building is? Can we just put it back up on top of the buildings and be able to store some of the water up there and then retranspire it away? So you're kind of getting some of that evapotranspiration back into the system. And there's other things that these ones do. You know, keep things cool. There's a whole bunch of reasons to use these. Obviously, it's hard to make them deep enough to hold a really big storm, so they only have a limited capacity to attenuate storm runoff. But nonetheless, this would be another example of green infrastructure and trying to get some of that natural functioning back into the system. Okay, and I think, is this Weil Hall? I think this one's at Cornell, obviously, but I can't remember what building that's on top of. Evidently, we have 3 or 4 of these. I don't know how many. Okay. Anyway, so that's another example. And also, by doing this, you're not having this one is also controlling the water quality issue, right? Because this water that would have gone on top of the rooftops maybe would have picked up contaminants up there, but more importantly, it would have eventually made it to the ground and picked up more contaminants. Okay, the porous pavement probably doesn't do that much for your contamination in and of itself, unless you have something underneath the porous pavement that would take out the contaminants. Okay, and I haven't actually seen anybody test that as a water quality remediation strategy. Okay. And these are my neighbors actually, Andra and Chuck Benson, and they built a straw bale house, and they put a green roof on it too. So it's not just for cities. You see these also in residential buildings as well, and they're one of those things that have kind of come in and out of phase over time, and are kind of on an upswing right now. They're kind of popular. It's a tricky thing though, because you got to get your reservoir of whatever the grass grows in deep enough that it doesn't dry out, so that the grass will keep growing. But you don't want it so deep that it crushes your house, because then you don't need a roof anymore, right? So that's the thing there. Okay. But probably the most common, when we think of green infrastructure, probably the most common. Okay. So one thing, green roofs are expensive to build. You got to do a lot more reinforcing of the building. It's very hard to retrofit a building once it's in place with a green roof. So that's pretty expensive. And the porous pavement I mentioned earlier is also an expensive endeavor, and there's a lot more to it than just putting porous pavement on. So the vast majority of what we call green infrastructure are these types of things. Okay, and what this is basically a depression in the ground. Okay, just like it's almost exactly the same as the detention basin I showed earlier. Okay, and so water here. This is Rice Hall. So you got these little cuts in the. Am I still on? Am I okay here? Okay. So you got these little cuts in the curb, and then you can see this little stone thing here. So the water comes off the parking lot into this pool area, and it sits. Okay. But now then, instead of putting it out through a pipe, we're going to let it go down into the soil. Okay. And the gold standard for one of these types of things is what we would call an infiltration basin. Okay, so the water would go in and it would actually go all the way down to the groundwater. And because it interacted with the soil and all those good things that happen there, the water would be, the quality of the water would be somewhat restored. In fact, our groundwater is naturally usually pretty clean, unless you spill something into it, and it's largely because of the things that happen in the near surface zone to kind of take stuff out of the water. Everything, not nitrates, unfortunately. But anyways, so that's the gold standard, and there are places where that happens. If you go to Illinois, I've seen several of these where they'll spread the water out, and it actually will all the way infiltrate into the groundwater. I think Cortland actually has a few of these that do that as well. It's not as easy to do as you would think, though. Okay, if you try and put it into too small an area, you'll actually waterlog the soil. You just can't get it to go down and move laterally fast enough, so it'll eventually just build up and build. And we actually see this in places where they do irrigation. They'll irrigate a place, and the soils will eventually become waterlogged just because it's one thing to get it to go down, but then it also has to go sideways, and it does that very, very slowly. So if you keep putting water in one place, it tends to build up. Around here, we have an even harder problem in a lot of places having the water completely infiltrate into the groundwater, because very shallowly in the soil we have bedrock, or we have what's called a fragipan, basically a clay layer that if you ever just go out sometime, go right down to the art squad and take a shovel and dig down. Okay, when you get down about 50 centimeters, you will hit a clay layer that's like digging into concrete. I mean, you're pinging out little tiny bits of soil. It's terrible. Okay, so around here it's hard to make these into true infiltration basins. So we have to do something different. Let's see if it's on the next slide. Oh no, here's just some other pictures of these things. We'll talk about what the difficulties are in a minute. So there's lots of these types of things. Okay, I call that last one there a detention basin. That's usually not what we call these when we're talking about green infrastructure, because that sounds so 1980s. Okay, so we call these bio something, right? Okay, that's what so this is a bio swale or a bio retention basin or a rain garden, something that sounds, I don't know, something like you want to have at home, you know. So and I don't. Do constructed wetlands fall into the arena of green infrastructure? Does anybody know? Okay, so that's another. So this one here is one of the constructed wetlands designed for storm runoff from where the library annex went in. So all these places where you kind of store water for a while and you allow natural processes to hopefully clean it up is that's the most common type of green infrastructure. Okay, and here's one I found for the Cornell plant. Has there been over to the plantations and seen their big rain garden? It's pretty cool. That's a pretty nice one. I like that one. Lauren spent some time down in there measuring gases. But anyways, so I put this up here because you can. So here's a picture, sort of a diagram of the parking lot, and they got a sidewalk, and all the water's going to go into this bio swale. There you go. That's what this one's called. But what you have here, they have the same problem you have everywhere, that they can't get the water to go all the way down to the groundwater quickly enough. There's this restrictive layer. So you can see here there's a little white dot, and that represents a drain tile, basically a pipe with holes in it so the water can get in. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that way, instead of having the water build up, it'll go into this pipe. If it's saturated, then that pipe takes it someplace. Okay. So the one thing you've done between the detention basin, where it just goes out a hole in the wall, and this is you force the water to move through some soil. And so we're hoping, in the same way that septic system works, that you'll get some sort of remediation, either from microbial processes or chemical processes that will remove the contaminants. Okay, and so that's the way these things work. Questions? Did I forget your favorite green infrastructure?
Actually, I do have a question.
Yes.
So, if you're making these on a fairly large scale, are they going in with heavy machinery to dig big holes and kind of mix up gravel or mix in substrates that'll help the water?
Excellent question. Yes. So yeah, they do use big machinery. Although I think we could use undergraduates here at Cornell to replace that. But again, even an undergraduate has a very small foot, right? So there's still a lot of pressure. But so yeah, they do dig these out in different. So this is great. I think this, for all the 90s, you could make your own bio something that was a little different than somebody else's and get your PhD. But yeah, so they usually do try to amend the soils with something that would encourage some process. Okay, oftentimes it's some sort of carbon enrichment that you put in there. Okay, so one of the things that's still a problem with the design of these things is that at a process-based level, we don't fully understand what's happening. Okay. In fact, there's been very few studies to show whether these things actually work. And the ones that have been done have kind of gone out to show that they do, which is not necessarily always the best way because somebody's the inventor of the bioswale and wants to show how good it works, and then, you know, so one way you can always show these things work is you juice them with really big contaminant loads, and you always see a big reduction, okay? But it's not always big contaminant loads that come off of the parking lot. So trying to get a representative description of what's going on is hard. But yeah, so we don't really know even what all the processes are in these things. So the designs are sort of more logic-based. Put more carbon in, that'll probably be good, you know, rather than like these particular processes will happen. Okay, so how am I doing? Am I okay on time? I really wish I had that music. Okay.
I will do that for you at the end.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to. So these haven't been that widely studied. So this kind of, and so it was actually an undergraduate, a pair of undergraduates that came to me, and they just been, while they've been working in our lab, going all over campus, said, does anybody know what's going on with those detention basins? And they started looking. They were able to find one study. I think there's actually more than that, but there weren't that many studies showing whether these things work or not. So they said, you know what? Let's go out and see if they're working. And so they thought about this. So they went out and we worked with the facilities people, and we identified a whole bunch of detention basins on campus. Okay, and so those, the names we gave them are associated usually with the building that they're near. Okay, and so EHOB is actually East Hill Office Building up by East Hill Plaza, and LAR 2 is the Large Animal Research and Teaching Unit, I think. Okay, and the rest I think are self-explanatory. BLAT's not a building, of course, but anyways. So they chose these ones because there was a range of ages from when they went in. If these students had like not graduated 2 years ago, they could have got the Furno one as well, but they chose to graduate. And there was different ages. So one thing that's interesting is Cornell's been experimenting with these before they were actually mandated to have to do them, because they wanted to. So that's kind of a progressive thing. And then they had different, you know, different areas of the actual parking lots they were serving, and the actual size of the basin. So we had a lot of variability here. So we thought, let's look at this and see what combinations work, or maybe they all work. Maybe none of them work, but we at least have some differences. And the other thing is that these different types of inlets. Okay, so SS stands for stone spillway. A pipe means that there's somehow the water is put in a pipe before it gets into the basin, and then scupper just means that they cut out a piece of the. Why do we call it a scupper? That's dumb. It's just a cut out piece of the curb. Okay, where the water over into the side. Okay, so we thought maybe that would have something to do with how effective these were as well. Okay. And so that you kind of see where they are all over campus there. And you'll see in a minute, we did do some stuff with Furno as well, but I'm going to kind of show you two studies that we did, and you can see whether you think they're working or not. Okay, and here's some pictures of the actual detention basins. I should mention, these were all designed to be dry holes in the ground until it rained. Then they were supposed to fill up, and then they were supposed to drain out again. Okay. So one thing that we know, and we didn't know that was the case until I mean Lauren pressed a little bit to find out if that was true, and it was. But there are two of them, the two that have funky acronyms here, the East Hill Office Building and the Large Animal Research and Teaching Unit, both have standing water in them, and indeed cattails growing in them. So they're not dry, okay? And it appears that something's happened that's caused them to not drain so well anymore. So we now have another difference that we didn't anticipate having when we started this project. Okay, and one thing we were able to get is we were able to get the designs to confirm that they were all designed to do the same thing. Again, you can see the tile drain here. It's placed a little bit, a couple feet under the ground to get rid of the water so it won't build up. Okay, and indeed this is the LAR 2, the one it's all wet and growing cattails, and you can see it actually doesn't have a tile drain, so it shouldn't be doing that. Okay, and so we kind of looked at two different ways of trying to assess these. The two undergraduates that started this, their first idea was they thought, if we just look at how much contamination is coming in and going out, that's going to be really hard to get those samples. We're not going to really be able to measure the water going out. They said, maybe what we should do is just take soil samples in the basins, and then take soil samples from some control area nearby and compare how much contaminants are in those. Because if these things are working, they should be coming enriched with stuff we don't want in our water anymore. So that was a good idea. And so I said, go do that. And it turned out it was a lot harder than you'd think it would be. So one thing they did is they took one of these detention basins and collected hundreds of samples because they didn't know how many to collect. So they collected hundreds of these from both the control and the inside of the thing. And then they kind of they did sort of a statistical thing where they kind of resampled all their samples to figure out how few could we sample and still see the differences that we see when we look at hundreds at each site, right? So they were able to kind of refine their thing before they went and sampled everything, okay? And I'll just tell you that we did this, submitted it to a journal, it came back with really good reviews, except somebody said, you know, we'd really like to see that water in, water out thing too, okay? So we actually did that as well. So here's we just used integrated samples. So here's a bottle we put in the, right there's the parking lot, and so the water just, you know, during a storm would come in to fill up that. And then we also tried to do these wherever we could at the outlets. It wasn't always easy to get to the outlets, and I got upset at some of the undergraduates for being scared of going down in manholes. But, so you'll see we have some gaps because they were wimps. Okay, so let's first look at this one where we took the soil sample. So these contaminants accumulate in the basins partially because they stick to the soils or they get caught up in the biota in the basins. So what we did is we collected these soil samples, and then we did like a nitric acid digestion to get the stuff off those. We didn't do a super aggressive one because we didn't want all the geology to dissolve and figure out, you know, but we wanted to kind of get what the stuff that was absorbed. So we digested them with a nitric acid thing, and then we used an ICP to kind of get the different elements that were in there. Okay, that's how we did it. And they collected these from all those basins, and so they also were interested in where in the basin do these things accumulate. Okay, so they kind of, this is how they kind of did their design. They kind of said, okay, we got this pool area, that's pretty easy to identify, but then these inlets, what if this stuff is really reactive in that water, and as soon as it gets in this material here, it absorbs out. Let's look at those as two separate places we can sample, and then the control area was something within the basin but high enough up that it shouldn't get in contact with runoff very often, or storm runoff. So that was their design. Good, bad, or indifferent. I think they took 5 or 6 samples from each of those to compare in each basin. Okay, and so what this is, let me explain what this is. So what they did then is they would just look at the difference between the contaminants inside the basin and the contaminants in the control. Okay, so if they were higher in the basin than in the control, you get a positive number. Okay, and so what we're seeing here is the dark blue part of this bar is the difference between what was in the inlet part of the basin and the control, and then the light blue is the difference between what was in the pool and the control, and then stacked together is like the total difference, right? So you can see if we look at sulfate, for example, and then down here are the different basins. Okay, so if we look at sulfate here, for example, virtually every basin except for the large animal one had accumulated sulfur or sulfate?
Total sulfur.
Okay, total sulfur relative to the control, and these little stars mean that they were significantly different. Okay, and in fact, for all of these contaminants, all 6 of these, in general, it seems like the basins were absorbing them. Not always significantly, but at least it was the right direction. LAR2 here is kind of a problem basin for us, but so that was good. And they looked at a whole bunch, but they kind of distilled things down to 12 that they focused on. Here things get a little less good for us. So the lead, unfortunately, is a little noisy, but nothing was significant one way or the other for the lead, which was good, right? So the one study we looked at from the 80s, there was tons of lead, but I think that was before the unleaded gasoline thing. So I think that's gone away. But we have things like potassium. Not that that's a contaminant, but you can see these basins, according to this analysis, are generally being depleted of potassium and of cobalt, which is kind of interesting too. And some of these other ones are not quite as consistent. Okay, so so we tried to kind of figure out what's going on there, and we didn't find any relationships with basin age. We didn't find any relationships with the ratio of how big the parking lot was relative to the basin, the detention basin itself. But we did kind of just let's just kind of look at these things in a gross way here. And so these are the contaminants that were being accumulated in a significant sense inside the basins, and these are the ones that were being depleted, and again significantly depleted. And you can see that all the basins were accumulating something, although it was not always the same something, which was a little bit interesting. And B-lot actually was behaving the best, okay? And let me tell you a little story about B-lot, okay? This is one I didn't think we should include because my class had designed B-lot, not that was a bad design, I knew some things about the lot that were a little special, okay? So again, most of these basins are designed so the whole water runs off the parking lot, into the hole, moves through the soil, out the drain pipe to the stream. B-lot doesn't work that way, okay? Does everybody know where B-lot is? Okay, it's an enormous expanse of asphalt, right? And if you go into B-lot, you'll see that there are surface drains all over B-lot going underground, okay? So they're already going into the storm system. But what was happening in B-lot is that someplace in the system it was clogged, somewhere far away from B-lot, we think. Because what would happen is when you had a big storm, well, okay, let me back up a little bit here. There's two things that were wrong with B-lot. There was at least two things. There may have been more than two things. One thing that was wrong with B-lot is all those surface drains. When they redid B-lot several years ago now, they had two contractors. One contractor was in charge of putting those surface drains, they're called catch basins, those square graded things, and they had another contractor that was in charge of paving. And those two people didn't talk to each other, I don't think. Because the people that put in the drains, the surface drains, the square drains, they had to come in first, right? Because you got to do that before the asphalt. And so they put those in, and then the asphalt people came in, and they put the asphalt in, and it was a little lower than the top of the drains, okay? So that meant the water was unlikely to jump up and go into the drain by itself, okay? So unless you had a lot of water, it didn't go into the drain, it just kept cruising down the parking lot, which was a problem because there was a curb at the end of the parking lot, and it would back the water up, and it would start flowing into the one drain that was there, but it couldn't take all the water, and so it would back up and it would flood whatever cars were in the lower end of the parking lot. So Cornell's solution for this, for about 5 years, was just to simply put a barricade and say, don't park there because your car. So that was working for a while until one time it backed up so high in this area, which could now even back up higher because they had barricades, that about 50 meters away or 100 meters away, a manhole cover that was in a lower elevation popped off because of the water pressure. Okay, and so I thought, oh, no problem, they'll just weld that on so it can't pop off again. But no, they said we'll do something about this. So what they did is they made a detention basin in B-lot, below B-lot. Okay, which what happens is everything happens the way it happened before. The system backs up and then flows into the detention basin. So we don't really know. It's hard to tell exactly what's happening there because the water does go into the pipe until it gets too much, it overwhelms the pipe, and then it backs up like your toilet and then spills into the basin. So it just has a very different behavior than the other ones, okay? But it's the one that works the best, so maybe we should do them all that way. Okay? We should like stick rodents or something in the pipes so that they back up the water and we get, okay. So we also noticed that these three here seem to kind of just work the least good, okay? And interestingly, one of our things that we thought, well, maybe it's how fast it takes to drain away. Maybe if it stays there longer. So it turns out rice, you almost never see standing water in the rice basin. It drains away pretty quickly. But the wrestling one drains pretty slowly. You can go a couple days later, it's still pretty wet in those ones. So anecdotally, it doesn't look like that's the issue, but we do want to go back and test that this summer and test some infiltration rates. Okay, so the take-home message is it does appear that there are a lot of things accumulating in these things, and don't worry about potassium. That's not a contaminant. It's very mobile. We shouldn't have even did it, but the machine shot it out. Okay, but one thing we did is we said, well, what about that inlet versus pool area? Like, where's the stuff accumulating? And so what we did is we looked at we kind of averaged up how much was being accumulated in the pool and the inlet across all the basins to just kind of see if there was a part of it that was more functional. So that's what these next slides are. And so if you look at, and we're not going to go talk about all these, but if you look at the sulfate, for example, you can see a lot accumulates in the inlet, and the different letters mean significantly different from each other. And then a lesser so in the pool area, but both are different than the control, which is the lowest. Okay. Now we had some things where we looked at like phosphorus, for example, and there was no significant difference. Look at the open bars, okay? And then we said, well, you know, we got those 3 really crappy basins. What if we got those out of the thing? So we threw those away, and then you could see that the inlet and the pool area, mostly the pool area is at least significantly different than the control. Okay, and so we kind of looked at it this way, and it is interesting. There's a lot of the contaminants or substances that seem to accumulate right at that inlet area. So that might be an important place to. And I think what happens if it cannot, the fine sediments settle out there, and they have a lot of this stuff absorbed to them. I think is what's happening there. But you can see for something like lead, all the levels were low, so it didn't matter whether we included the basins that didn't work very well or not. Other things like copper, where we saw no differences, if we remove those 3 basins where things weren't doing so well, we did see differences. Okay.
Excuse me, what is the gray? Is that a
Oh,
standard
so-
design? I can't quite read it.
That's right. So I did that on purpose. So we found a study done in crop and soil sciences where somebody had gone all over the state and collected soil samples, mostly from ag land actually. But then it kind of gave, and then so we got kind of a range of what's sort of the background levels of these contaminants, for several of them anyway. So these gray bars are sort of the range of levels he was finding in non-urbanized areas. Okay, and so you can see for chromium here, for example, we're kind of in the band. For something like lead, we're actually a little bit above it, you know. So that was just kind of, that's what that is. Okay, and so then, like I said, we submitted this. It was well received, but they said, you know what, it would really be helpful if we knew what was the contamination coming in and going out of your basin. I'm going to be done shortly, don't worry. And so these students went out, and you can see these are the sorts of things they had to climb into to get these samples. And we actually were able to include Ferno because by the time we got around to this, it was in place. And we actually took the soil samples too. I don't know why I didn't have those, but we have the soil information. Not much is accumulated in Ferno yet. Okay, and so we did the same thing. So we actually did this twice. Once where I was paying attention, and before that, once where I wasn't. Okay, and when I wasn't paying attention, the students were collecting the water, simply running it through the ICP, and then looking at what was in it, right? But the problem is they also were filtering the samples, and most of the stuff was stuck on the sediments. And the way they filtered, they got the filter with the sediment that stuff on it. That's the good stuff, and that went in the garbage. And then they did the water. Okay. And so then about 9 months later, when I realized what they were doing, we said we got to start over again and not do that. So we did the same thing where we used a nitric acid and got the stuff to come off the sediments, and then analyzed it. Okay. And we look at inlet inflows and outflow concentrations. Okay. I want to give this the blame for this graphic entirely to Lauren. She made this for me. Okay, and so in this one here we have a lot more compounds. We were not able to get into the B lot outlet and what was the other one? University. We had two bases that we were not able to get into, but the rest of them we were able to get into. And so this is the difference in the concentration coming in and going out, okay? And the red areas are where it's more concentrated leaving the basin, or the red squares are where it's more concentrated leaving the detention basin than coming in, and the blue is the opposite, okay? And I think that the take-home message here is it's a mixed bag when you look at the concentrations, isn't it? And so we realized it's probably not the concentration that's important, it's the total amount that comes in versus the total amount that goes out. So we did a little calculation. We had our concentrations, these were measured, and then we were able to kind of look at the rainfall record and estimate how much actual material moved in. And then we had to do a little bit of modeling because these detention basins also evaporate too. So we had to kind of do a soil water budget for them to figure out how much goes out. But then we get an estimate of how much went out as well. And then this was the result. Now blue here means we got a net accumulation in the basin. And so you can see, except for Ferno here, which it's young, it's still growing up. It's a baby basin, so it's expected not to perform as well as everybody else. But the other ones, and those calculations were run for the entire life of how old the basin was. And so you can see here that most of them are blue. So most of the things, according to this type of a calculation, show that there is less leaving the basin than coming into the basin. Okay? And now then, the question, so we're still working on analyzing these data, but the question was, does this jive with what we saw with our soil samples? Okay? And so that's the scary thing to look at. And so last night, so here's our, so I tried to figure out, can I just have you guys look at this? Here's what we saw with the soils, and then go back to here, and then you'd be able to synthesize that, okay? And there's a few things that make that difficult. First of all, I did it really quickly. Second of all, there's more chemicals here than there are over there. Thirdly, Lauren alphabetized her chemicals, and the undergraduates didn't. So there's a lot of things a lot of synthesis you have to do to make this comparison. So I tried to facilitate this a little bit. So here I've taken Lauren's table and reduced it, and now the other thing we've done now is Lauren's table was like this, and now we've tilted it like this. So that's also going to make things hard. But so here's all of our basins, and what I did here is these red the red bars are the four compounds that were statistically significantly higher in most of the basins based on the soil samples. Okay, and what you can see here when you look across these, what I'm going to wave my hand to help you see is that when you look at these numbers here, I mean, this is 4,500. These are all, you know, mostly in the thousands, and then you compare it to the ones where they weren't significantly different. They're much smaller numbers. So if you look at just an order of magnitude, and you just look at our basins where we saw like a lot of them having significant accumulation in the soil samples, it seems to be sort of jiving with the the analysis where we look at the water in and out, and we can actually drill just a little bit higher. These are actually the three basins that were the most statistically significant based on the soil samples, and those are also pretty high. The one outlier here is Rite Aid was a high one based on the water samples, but wasn't necessarily statistically significant based on our water samples. If we look at this one here, indeed, the three highest accumulations based on the water are also the three highest that we saw with the soil samples. So we're seeing some patterns. Again, sulfur, remember everything accumulated sulfur except for wrestling, and you can see again here that's represented here.
So is are those the deicers that are, I mean, if I understand what you're saying. Are you saying there's really high levels of the calcium and the sodium? Are those deicers that are?
Oh, what the source of them is?
Yeah.
It could. I'm assuming it's from the salts. Yeah.
Okay.
And we usually don't see, you know, sodium was kind of a mixed bag because sodium can be pretty mobile still, right? But calcium, you could imagine it kicking out. Maybe that's where that potassium's going. The calcium's kicking it off the matrix here. Okay, and again here, if we look at the three highest in our zinc category, those were also the three that were statistically significant based on the soil. So we're seeing at least some patterns emerging here, even though they're not always a one-to-one relationship. Okay, I can stop right there. We talk about water quality. If anybody wants me to, I can talk about these things in the context of greenhouse gases, but I'm happy to stop there too if people want to discuss things. I wouldn't want to listen to me talk this long, so. Great, I think we have consensus. Whatever it is consensus.
Just one question, real
okay.
quick. So I'm just curious, I mean, like you said, not many people have documented all that, and so, but you're seeing accumulation. So do you think it's like feeding into the food webs? I mean, those act as sinks for some amphibians and stuff. Do you think that whole thing is going into the insect and the amphibian world at all?
Oh, that things that would habitat these detention basins?
Yeah.
I don't see why it wouldn't. I don't know enough about like how high it has to get before it starts to move through amphibian skin and stuff. But yeah, I would assume where you see higher concentrations of these things, they would be affecting the whole ecosystem there. Yeah, maybe this is a way to keep the mosquitoes from breeding in here in these things. That's what people are always concerned about. You just juice them up with lead. That's good.
And one big question too that's still like largely unanswered in the literature is like when you should be cleaning out these basins, because that is a practice that's done in some of them is, you know, they accumulate some point at which they really become contributors because they basically can't hold any more contaminants. So that especially becomes an issue if you're thinking about like potential for bioaccumulation.
But I really like your stuff because you did that inlet versus the pool, and so if they had a micro pool,
yeah,
they would just scrape that. I mean, they could actually really prolong the life of these and keep them a lot cleaner with just a micro pool to capture.
Yeah.
What if you think it's a fine set, you know, so
yeah, and that's something that has been anticipated by people designing these, because a lot of these come. I mean, ours don't always have them on campus, but a lot of, when you look at the designs that people are putting in, a lot of them come with that as a thing. They have a forebay.
Yeah, forebay.
Where they kind of let the water kind of sit for a while before it spilled over to the main pool, and the idea is then you want to clean out a small part.
So in general, it seemed that these were pretty efficient at remediating the runoff.
So, in general, they were all accumulating something. The thing is that it was not always consistent, and we couldn't tell, because we don't have a process level understanding of why these things are accumulating, it's hard to even tell exactly, like why were those 3 basins hardly accumulating anything?
Did you look at plants at all and what they were doing, or like the subsurface soils?
So we didn't look at that, except we did look at the wet and dry ones as being two groups, and oddly enough, they were kind of split. You know, one of the unfortunate things I should mention, the university and BLOT were like the two of the very best ones at accumulating stuff based on our soil samples, and they designed it in a way where undergraduates were scared to go and get the outflows. So that was an unfortunate thing in our design. And so based on the water thing, it looks like I don't know about efficient. So efficiency is one of those things that EPA has backed away from, because they did learn that you can something will look very efficient if you put a really heavy load into it. You'll get a big reduction, but that efficiency goes down when you feed it with less. So the efficiency question, I don't know. We didn't do that calculation. But based on this, there's a lot of blue. That means it's doing something good. Furno, not so good yet. Hopeful though.
More like an initial condition.
Yeah, and notice all those numbers are, even though they're all look like losses, I don't think any of those are within our detection limit.
So one more quick question. So in some of the wetland literature, they look at them in terms of phosphorus filtering. There's this whole thing of it's 1 kilogram centimeter or something, a rule, but it's basically phosphorus gets saturated and it stops absorbing anymore at a certain level. But there's not much done on the time or how much total, how long it takes. But in a way, do you think you've hit the saturation level for any of those, like the calcium or anything in those systems, where maybe then it just doesn't absorb anymore?
So, let me change your question to this. Have we hit it for phosphorus? I don't think so.
Okay.
But these other, I don't know about these other ones. Yeah, calcium could, but again, calcium is really not a pollutant that we're concerned about. But and one thing we didn't do in the soils, we didn't do chloride, and it turns out that gets really high in these basins, but it's very transient too. By June, it's all washed back down to the background level again. Yes, Sri.
What would you do if you were to clean that? Like, where would you take that substrate and can you recover it in some way, or like with the combination of the heavy metals and the other compounds?
Yeah, it's a good question. So where would I put it? That's a good. I don't know where. I mean, that's the sort. Once you have heavy metals involved, it's almost always a hazardous waste that you have to just put in the landfill until we figure out how to remine that out and access it. But people have talked about using phytoremediation as a potential thing you could stack on top of this to try and get some of that stuff out. But then you still have to take the plants and do something with them. But so I don't have a good answer for you, and I never thought about where I would put it personally.
Next research proposal, I guess.
Yeah, there you go. Yes. Good. Susan.
Well, so how would you recommend, if you were going to do this all again, Todd, or have other people try and sample these kind of systems to see how effective they are at retaining contaminants? How would you do it? Have you learned anything?
So I can tell you what the challenges are that were unfortunate. Okay, one of the things is that when you look at so Cornell has some designs for these things, and so the basic dimensions are correct in there, and you can kind of see how they were built, but then if you look at the soil amendment, who was asking about what you were asking about whether they. So then what they do is the contractor who does it says these are the things that we sometimes use for soil amendments, but you don't really know what they actually use. So there's a lot of gaps in our understanding of what's even there. According to Peter Trowbridge, the rice one is a very, very sandy material that went in there that perhaps drains too quickly and maybe isn't as effective. So there's some critical information that would be nice to know. Originally, we thought that there were 3 basins that seemed to be losing so much more material than they were gaining, that we thought maybe a biosol, like a municipal sludge, had been used for the carbon amendment, which would have been bad because that stuff is rich in heavy metal. So we went to look to see if that was the case, because that was one of the things that was listed on the contractor's list of things. So we went to look for evidence of that, and it's hard to find that. But it turned out the markers we looked for, we couldn't see anything different about those basins than the other ones. So we've kind of backed off making that assertion as, it was great when you could be totally speculative, but then when you look for it and it's not, you can't see it there, that's kind of disingenuous to continue to be speculative, right? So,
Looks like you were about to tell us the nitrous oxide differences across.
Do you want to see that?
I would like to see that.
Okay.
please.
So these are images I stole off the internet. So one of the things about these that we realize is that these things are very unique parts of the landscape. When you look at the natural landscape, there's nothing that receives a whole bunch of clean water into one area, and then it sits there and drains away. So we thought these might behave kind of different. And so we've been doing a lot of work looking at what goes on in these wet areas in other types of landscapes, and in particular looking at greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen and carbon cycling, and also trying to figure out other ways to characterize it. So we've looked at what we call a topographic wetness index, and then we have all these measurements where we look at and see what's the moisture across all these different parts of the landscape relative to the mean, and we're able to characterize the soil moisture pretty well, and that's allowed us to then go and ask these questions. So here's one of my graduate students actually measured denitrification in the landscape and used that wetness index as a background, and you can see we got some very strong relationships. And so we thought maybe these things, because these are areas that get wet and dry, maybe they're behaving in a way that could be important for greenhouse gases. So, and this is, by the way, is Lauren's work. And again, I'm sorry you can't see this better, but she went and put gas chambers in these detention basins, and she did kind of like what the undergraduates did. She put some inside the basin, and then she had some control chambers outside the basin, so she could see if there were any differences. And then she went out 10 times or something, and sampled these gases, and then looked for nitrous oxides and methane. Okay, and there she is doing it. Actually, I think it's staged. She's not really doing anything there. Are you doing something?
It's a video.
Oh, this is a vid. Oh, okay. It's gonna move. That's not a video. Okay, so here's the nitrous oxide emissions, okay, and for the different basins, and then ref means outside the basin, and when it's not a ref, it means not outside the basin, inside the basin, and so or you can look at blue and white, and you can see here there's not a lot of in fact I don't think there's any significant differences there, and you can see that they're all kind of centered around 0. So we may just be simply seeing something about the detection limit or the quantification limit of our instruments and processing. Okay, so not too much there. Okay, that's from March through November, and then here's the methane flux though. Okay, and here we suddenly get an outlier here. Again, the reference. So you can see here this East Hill office building. This is one of the ones where the drainage system's not working. You got cattails growing. This is acting like a wetland, and as you would expect, we're getting methane out of there. Okay, what we think happened in these two where it's not so. I thought at first what was happening in these ones where it wasn't draining is that fine sediments were coming in and sealing up the soil. So I sent Brianne Lieber, my son undergraduate, I said, go get samples from the surface of the very surface, and see if they're rich with these fine sediments. And so she faithfully would go out and sample a bunch of these and come back and do this texture analysis, which took all day for every basin. And so she did this all through the summer, and she showed that's not what's happening, okay? But what it looks like is happening, because Lauren just found a place where the tile line had. So what happens is these tile lines are perforated pipes, right? And so as long as water is going into them, everything's happy. As soon as they clog up, and one of the things that actually clogs it up, a guy in Pew County told me, woodchucks will clog these things up. We don't have any verification that that's what's happening here, but what happens is the water can go into these holes, right? And it moves down the pipe. It has to be sloped so the water gets out. But if there's a jam in it, right, what happens is it builds up pressure there, okay? And so the water then starts pushing against the soil particles around the pipe. So it's trying to get out of the holes. And you can imagine if you get that pressure enough, you kind of open up that matrix, and all the fines get washed out, and the whole thing collapses in a big hole. And Lauren found one of these at the East Hill Plaza, and that's sort of exactly what it looks like. So we think that that's a critical part of these things, is keeping those drain pipes open. Okay, and again, we don't know what clogged it, but that's what happened. So that's the greenhouse gas story.